All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Great to see such a great turnout today for our Entrepreneurship Speaker Series. So Dana and Tim, could we continue that conversation maybe after the lectures? All right, good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Robert Family Entrepreneurship Speaker Series and introduce you to today's speaker, Dr. Michael Weickert. Dr. Weickert has spent his career working at the intersection of science and business, where rigorous research and discovery enters the world of building companies. With more than 30 years of experience developing drugs and medical devices across both public and private companies, Dr. Weickert currently serves as CEO of two biotech companies, including Pacylex Pharmaceuticals, a clinical stage oncology company, and Fe Pharmaceuticals, which is developing novel anti-infective approaches. Over the course of his career, he's helped to move multiple technologies from early concepts into clinical development, sourced nearly $200 million of investment in partnerships, which to me is very impressive. He said it's never enough, never ending, and played key roles in major strategic transactions and exits. I think what's especially relevant to this audience is that Dr. Weickert has lived the full arc of translation from scientific promise to the realities of fundraising, regulatory strategy, clinical planning, portfolio decisions, and partnering. For anyone thinking about spinning out your research, joining an early stage company, or for those that are already in the thick of it, which is an increasingly large portion of our community, today's talk, which I think might be the best talk title we've ever had, is Dumb Ways to Die, How Biotech Startups Fail. This is not going to be a theory talk, which is great. Dr. Weickert will speak about avoidable mistakes, the structural realities and decision point to determine whether a discovery becomes a product that reaches patients or a great idea that dies on the vine and never leaves the lab. In addition to leading companies, Dr. Weickert has also spent years mentoring founders and helped shape business plans for everyone from first-time faculty founders to even a Nobel laureate at one point. And that perspective, grounded in science but sharpened by real-world experience and decision-making, is what makes his lessons so valuable to us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Weickert.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that warm welcome. And I'm delighted to be here. I actually have a son who went here briefly. And so I've been up to Oregon a bunch. And when I was up here with him, I said, oh, I've got to check out this night school of entrepreneurship and introduce myself. And here I am. So what we're going to talk about today is exactly what was described, practical experience in how you actually experience startups. And I want to know, before I start, a little bit about the character of this particular audience. So who has been an entrepreneur at some point or is currently an entrepreneur? Wow, excellent. Who is an aspiring entrepreneur and would like to be an entrepreneur? Excellent. And who's here just to talk about or listen to the train wrecks, kind of like NASCAR? Excellent. Well, that covers just about everybody. So I'm going to talk about those train wrecks. I'm going to talk about Dumb Ways to Die. And for those who haven't ever seen it, which I can't believe is any of you.
Set by two hands, broke stick at grizzly bear. Eat medicine, it's out of date. Use your private parts as garage.
So it may be the only thing you remember from today's talk, but this is originally a public service announcement for the New Zealand train system. So we celebrate success all the time. You hear about the successful biotechs, the successful pharmaceuticals. I'm going to talk about biotech in particular because that's my area of expertise, but it applies to lots of different startups in all different industries. You hear about the successes all the time. You don't hear about the failures. What do engineers study when they want to know how to make something work better? They study the failures. They don't study the successes. And we need to spend more time studying the failures so that we do a better job of not repeating those mistakes. If you're going to make mistakes, and you are going to, if you're an entrepreneur, make new ones, please. So we have data on why startups fail. It's not necessarily very clean and very helpful. A lot of it points to teams being the failure point for many startups. Certainly, Noam Wasserman in The Founder's Dilemma describes teams as being the problem for 2/3 of all startup failures. And I'm going to show you examples of very specific ways in which team members or teams have let an idea down. They've let a product that actually works down. But in biotech, there's another layer of failure on top of the traditional sort of why do startups fail, and that is the natural attrition rate of biotechnology products, particularly drugs. So if you have spent 3 or 4 years developing a lead for a new target, and you're now ready to go into preclinical testing that would be necessary to get a product in development, you have less than a 1% chance. You're less than 1% of the way to making a product. And it feels insane that you will have spent years getting that lead and you're still only less than 1% of the way there. Let's say you got to phase 2. So you got through tox, you got through phase 1 safety in patients. You're in phase 2. You are 25% of the way to getting an actual product. So this natural attrition rate is why startups fail in biotech at an extraordinary rate. 90% of them are going to fail. Even VCs who are trying to pick the winners because they're so smart, 75% of them are going to fail. And that's the reality of biotech. Okay, so startups fail at an extraordinary rate. Biotech fails even more. And there are a lot of good reasons to die. Okay, so let's get those out of the way right away. A bad idea, obviously, don't even start, please. But a lot of times the science of biology doesn't work. If you're one of the if you came up with a lead and it doesn't work, that's okay. That's science, A lot of scientific stuff doesn't work. A lot of hypotheses don't pan out. So it's okay. Move on, do something else. A lot of things aren't cheaper than the existing alternative. And by cheaper, I mean, if you have a new idea and it's going to be 10% less expensive than what already exists for treating those patients, don't even bother. Okay, that's not enough. That's not going to get you over the threshold that you need to get over in order for it to be adopted by practitioners as a new therapy or new product. You need to be 50% or better. A lot of things can't make money. If you have a new procedure, a new technique, those are great and they should be developed and they should be disseminated. Absolutely. They're not going to be a company. They're not going to be a product that you're going to market and sell. And a lot of that depends on whether you can create some exclusivity around your idea and concept. And we'll talk about that as well in some of the examples that I'm going to give you. And there are some things that are just out of your control. You do not control the fact that the biotech market has been in a downturn since the pandemic in terms of funding. You cannot control that. And when that happens, or when like today, 2/3 of all venture capital funding is going into AI, that is out of your control, but it's going to make it really hard to raise money. Unless, of course, you say, I'm going to do an AI version of something for biotech. And then, of course, you're riding the wave instead of fighting the wave. So I'm going to talk about 6 characteristics that I think are critical to successful startups. Okay, I call them teamed. And it starts with the team. You have to have a team that you can trust, where everybody's doing their part and working well together. You have to have good execution, which means you have to have on your team experience of doing this before. You can't just come in and say, okay, I'm gonna read the book about it. I'm gonna have an advisor tell me about it. No, you have to have team members who've done this before. Because if you don't, you're gonna stumble and make a lot of mistakes you don't need to make. You have to have access to money. I'm going to talk about this a lot because that's probably the most important thing to be successful as a biotech. You can have everything else perfect. If you don't have access to money, that's a huge problem. You got to have a market that's clear and is significant so that investors know they're going to get a return on their investment when you get this product to market. You've got to have exclusivity to protect that opportunity, and you've got to have differentiation so that you are different than other products in a way that's meaningful and that people are going to be willing to pay for. It's really money. If you have one thing you have to do best, access to money, raising money, that is the most important thing that you will go into being an entrepreneur about and probably not have any experience with if you're a first-time entrepreneur. And that is where you need to have the most help. You either need to have a network of people that you can trust and call on to help you connect with people who have the money to invest in what you're doing, or you have to bring somebody in who has that, or you have to hire somebody who does that. Because this is what allows companies to succeed. So one of the things venture capital loves to do is they hire people who've been successful. Okay, those are people that they gave money to before that were successful, and they were successful largely because they had the money. Okay, so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy here. If you give money to a VC, from a VC to a company and they're successful, it in large measure was because they got money, not necessarily because they had a better idea than everybody else or a better team than everybody else, but they got the money to do the job. So that is, unfortunately, the most important thing you as an entrepreneur need to do is try to find a way to fund what you're doing. So I'm going to give you 4 case studies of failures. And these are failures of products that work, products that were differentiated, products that if they made it to market at the time they were being developed would have made a big difference. And I'm going to look at these 6 axes that I've described to you for each one of them. And what you can see right now is for these 4 that I'm going to tell you about, okay, they all have differentiation. They all have markets. They all have, for the most part, exclusivity except the one. So what's failing? Frankly, the team is letting the product down. First thing I'm going to talk about, I call Tomb of the Unknown Founders. So there's a problem with starting a company that's a little bit ironic. Many innovations are discovered by people outside of the current status quo. If you're in the status quo, you're invested in what we already know about a disease or about a therapy. And the big exciting things come from people who aren't invested in that, who can think out of the box, but they're unknown to the status quo. And that presents a real problem. So the first one I'm going to tell you about involves gastric ulcers. So for decades, we knew that gastric ulcers were caused by diet, stress, and lifestyle. And we needed to manage those elements in order to prevent gastric ulcers from developing to a perforated ulcer or bleeding ulcer, something that would be potentially life-threatening. And then it was discovered that it was actually an infection caused by Helicobacter pylori. And suddenly we could give people antibiotics and we could cure gastric ulcers overnight. So that was a discovery that led to these 2 gentlemen receiving the Nobel Prize. Dr. Barry Marshall actually drank Helicobacter pylori to give himself an ulcer. Then he took antibiotics to cure himself of the ulcer, establishing what we call Koch's postulates in microbiology, to show that this definitively proved Helicobacter pylori was the cause and that you could treat it and successfully eradicate it. And for that discovery, which they published in 1984, they were awarded the 2005 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. It took 12 years for that publication to actually make it into the guidance for treating gastric ulcers. So for 12 years, we still treated it as diet, stress, and lifestyle. We didn't give antibiotics to gastric ulcer patients. It took a long time for that to penetrate the status quo, the medical establishment of what we do for ulcers, and actually become standard of care. And that happens all the time. But here's the weird thing. See this guy here, John Loukaitis. You've never seen him before, probably. He's a Greek physician who was a small town physician, and he had gastric ulcers. But he also had another disease in the GI system that everyone knew was an infection. So when he got that, he treated himself with antibiotics. And he noticed that it cured his ulcer too. And he followed up on that. And he developed a combination antibiotic therapy that he used to cure an estimated 30,000 Greeks of gastric ulcers. He got a patent on this in 1961 in Greece. So he developed this combination therapy. He treated patients. He got a patent. And he didn't get the Nobel Prize. Why not? What happened? So he had a great target product profile. I mean, he didn't, of course, create a target product profile. Nobody did those in those days. But hopefully, if you're an entrepreneur, you do this all the time. This is one of your disciplines. I'm including this for every one of these case studies because it's part of my discipline. It's part of the discipline of every group that I work with. Okay, gastric ulcers in 1960s were 10% of the population was going to have a gastric ulcer sometime in their life. That's a massive market that's unserved. Okay, he has a very specific product. Now, it has to be taken orally 6 to 8 times a day right now. Today, we would say that's ridiculous, but at the time, it was not unusual for medicines to be taken frequently. So it was perfectly acceptable then. He had selected components that were not readily absorbed from the GI system, so it wasn't going to cause systemic toxicity. Really well thought out, actually, for its day. And it had a very high cure rate. But the problem is he didn't do any controlled clinical studies. So what went wrong? Well, how come this unknown founder didn't get the Nobel Prize? Well, partly because he couldn't break through the medical establishment. He's unknown. Nobody knows this guy. He's not in infectious disease. He's not in ulcerative colitis, or not ulcerative colitis. He's not in any kind of institution that studies these things that's well known. So he's a nobody. He tried to publish in JAM and they said, no, this is not for us. He tried to actually get a mini phase 3 study done in Greece because he came to the attention of the Greek prime minister's office, but the physicians that he was supposed to work with on this said, no, we're not interested in doing the study. He contacted pharma companies, but they said, well, you only have a patent in Greece, so how do we protect it everywhere else? Because now it's public and you can't get a patent. And they also said then there's no clinical controlled studies, so there isn't enough evidence that we could promote this. And with all those rejections, he wasn't able to break through. So he had lots going for him, but he didn't have the exclusivity he needed in the patents. He didn't have the execution. He hadn't done any controlled clinical studies. And unfortunately, he didn't have the money to do those things. And the two groups he went to try to get the money were pharma companies and were the government. And both of them said, no, thanks. We're not interested. So he died in 1980, 4 years before Warren and Marshall published their results showing it was an infection and showing the specific organism. It's a real tragedy that we went 4 decades from this discovery and this therapy to when it was actually used globally as a treatment. We went 4 decades from that discovery. That's insane. And it's all because we couldn't accept a new idea. Now I'm going to tell you about another more recent example of the same thing. And this is ulcerative colitis. Generally, ulcerative colitis is believed to be an autoimmune disorder of some sort, but it really hasn't been narrowed down very well and understood very well. And there's an awful lot of risk factors for ulcerative colitis that don't really fit an autoimmune disorder paradigm. Now, this guy here, Dr. Jay Pravda, he's an immunologist working in Florida in his own private practice. A lot of his snowbird patients who come down for the winter have really poorly controlled ulcerative colitis. So he gets curious about this, and he has a very unique brain. He went into literature and looked at everything for an extended period of time, and he came up with a new theory in 2005, which he published called the radical induction theory, that oxidative radicals are creating erosion of the lining of the GI tract, allowing bacteria to infiltrate and causing the inflammation that we experience in ulcerative colitis. So he recruited a GI physician that had a massive practice in Tennessee to test this on his patients. And they did test a bunch of patients, and they got spectacular results. And most of the patients they tested this on weren't the mild to moderate patients that most drugs get tested on. They tested this on patients who had moderate to severe ulcerative colitis, which had already failed the conventional therapies. So they were testing the worst of the worst, and they were getting really nice results. So he found a company, a small biotech company, that actually was interested in licensing this, and he licensed it to them so they would provide development expertise. And we published a clinical case series in 2019 that showed excellent results from the first 35 patients that have been given this treatment. So again, great product profile. The experience with this product was twice as effective as the existing products. The existing products are only about 40% effective in inducing remission in ulcerative colitis patients with mild to moderate disease. It's not very good. Okay, there's a lot of upside here for these people. They have a specific product, a specific dose and regimen that's been tested on patients that provided 85% clinical and histologic, meaning that when you go in and you look at the GI lining is repaired. So it's not just they don't have symptoms. The GI lining has repaired itself. And 85% clinical and histologic remission in moderate to severe patients, some of whom were scheduled to go in and get a colectomy, get the whole colon removed. So this is an extraordinary advance over the current 40% or so success rate. So what went wrong? A lot of stuff went right. You know, this is so much better. It's ridiculous when you consider that these patients are also much worse patients. He got a therapy that worked, got remission very fast. Primary market research done with key opinion leaders in the space said that this profile is one that we would definitely prescribe this for our patients. Extraordinarily high scores from their market research. IP was issued, got a small pharma company involved, confirmed that it could be registered on a 505(b)(2) approval path, which is much easier than a new drug application to do, because it's composed of 4 components that have already been used as drugs, as therapies in the past. The problem was, because he had 4 components, the FDA wanted to do a multifactorial clinical study in which the contribution of every component was individually defined. That is an extraordinarily complicated and expensive study to run. And so the pharma company said, nah, that's not what we signed up for. Sorry, we're done. And the founder got the product back, but he didn't have any of the resources necessary to do this, nor could he interest anybody else in it, because it was expensive and the whole idea was controversial. The other thing is, these patients that were tested, it's a clinical case series. It doesn't rise to the rigor of, this is a well-controlled, placebo-controlled clinical study that has the rigor that people are going to accept. So whenever people see something done in this way, they assume that this is done in a cherry-picking way. But we're doing the worst of the worst patients. We're doing refractory patients. It's like a cancer study. The FDA doesn't require you to do a cancer study with a placebo control anymore when you do refractory and relapsed patients. Why? Because the FDA realizes if you can provide benefit to patients who have already failed everything else, that's meaningful. That's a clinical benefit. But that doesn't apply here in ulcerative colitis yet. So that meant this product, unfortunately, died. It's still available, technically, because we published the results, put it into the public domain, and anybody can get a compounding pharmacy to create this product. Does anybody do that? No. Does anybody know about it? No. Because there's nobody marketing it, because nobody makes any money on it. And if you can't make money on it, no one's going to market it and no one's going to know. And that's where we are. This therapy exists that can help serious UC patients and give you an 85% chance of remission. And nobody knows about it, and nobody ever will. Well, you guys know, but nobody else will. So what can we learn from these 2 things? It sounds harsh, but if you're unknown in the field by the thought leaders and the people who manage the status quo, and you have a theory that deviates from the current theory about the status quo, and you have great clinical results, the assumption is you're a quack, that this is a fraud. That's the assumption. And overcoming that assumption requires an extraordinary burden of proof, meaning you're going to have extremely well-designed, well-controlled clinical studies that provide the data necessary to get KOLs to agree that this makes sense, to agree that this actually is sufficient evidence to discard the previous hypotheses and to embrace this new one. That's really hard. That's really hard. And you need to cultivate somebody who's going to pay for that evidence, who is willing to entertain new ideas, new things that deviate from the status quo. And those are not everywhere. A lot of people, a lot of venture folks will say, we like new ideas. We like groundbreaking stuff. We like exciting new hypotheses, etc. They do like them. They like to hear about them. They fund other things. So it's hard to find the right investors who will embrace something like this. Oftentimes it's mission investors, high net worth people that have the disease or have people in their family that have the disease. Those are the kinds of people that can get behind a mission to change the way we look at a disease. I'm going to talk about some train wrecks that I personally led. And I'm also going to introduce the concept that zombies are not successes. Okay, and they become important when you look at how founders sometimes view some of the dilemmas, and you've probably heard about some of those dilemmas before. The first company was tackling IV drug errors, which is largely an invisible problem, but is a massive one in hospitals in particular. So there's about 450,000 IV drug adverse events every year. And there's about 4,000 deaths that result from those. So it's a big hospital problem. Hospitals know they have a problem. They don't talk about it because they don't want people to know that they have this problem. But it turns out that a majority of IVs have an error somewhere in their production or administration. And that's scary. Now, most of those errors are not going to kill you. So, you know, it may be an error in some process, but unfortunately, some do. And this came, you know, really out, I think, into the public eye in 2007 when Dennis Quaid had twins that were dramatically overdosed with heparin, and they almost died. They were essentially bleeding everywhere, and they almost died. And so that brought it to the public attention. I actually met Dennis Quaid at a conference where he was presenting his story. You know, it was a conference that had a session devoted to IV drug errors. And I actually went backstage and met him afterwards, surreptitiously, and asked if he could potentially help us raise awareness of this new technology we were developing to catch those kinds of errors. And he has other things to do. But this is personal. Okay, this is my oldest daughter, my firstborn, when she was 5 days old. You see all these IVs down here at the foot of her bed? She had just had open heart surgery. And so I cared very much about IVs being correct. So I was approached by two guys who were experienced with characterizing materials in other industries, not in medical devices at all. And one of them had a relative with an IV drug error. And so that brought awareness to them about this issue. And they realized their expertise in characterizing materials could apply very well to IVs. And so I was brought in because I knew about medical devices. And our collaboration designed a whole bunch of different products that could tackle the different steps involved in IV drug use and administration. And the products had pretty significant opportunities, market opportunities, and two of them had no requirement for FDA review. So they could be put on the market very quickly. So we had an excellent product profile. This one we actually did product profiling for. And we actually had a lot of things go right. So the three founders were all full-time, all equal owners of the company. So there's no, antagonism about different shares that different people have and different ownership and so forth, which can cause a lot of founder friction. The first two generations of the prototypes went great. Technology made significant advances and was showing extreme promise in what we were planning to do. We got patents issued. You need that. And I negotiated a corporate partnership with Becton Dickinson that was going to pay all the development costs and had an exit of up to 120 million. So big deal for an early stage medical device company. We had two products that didn't need FDA approval, so that was going to be very fast. And then we grew the company to 26 people, which for our stage and what we were planning to do was an appropriate number of people with all the expertise that we needed in positions all filled with people that had experience in developing medical devices. And my daughter had another open heart surgery while we were doing this and became our poster child for our booths at conferences where we presented the concept of what we were doing, where we presented a mock-up device so that people could play with it and give us feedback on it. And so still a very personal project, but something went wrong. So the founders had made design changes in our third generation, which unfortunately had negative effects. Okay, they changed the coding on the sensor, and now suddenly the sensor noise rose fourfold. They changed the dimensions of some of the sensors that were used for saline, and it resulted in a twofold lowering of the signal for drugs in saline. Normal saline is one of the most important fluids for IV administration. And so now things weren't working anymore. The problem isn't that things don't work. This happens all the time. The problem is the founders didn't know what they did wrong and insisted that something, it wasn't their fault. Things were okay. They would fix it because they always troubleshoot and fix things. That's what they were known for in their previous company. But they weren't fixing it because they didn't do a design control process. So they didn't know what they'd done wrong. They had no rigorous way of measuring things as they made changes so that they understood what those changes wrought. So I brought in engineers that had that experience, that knew what they were doing, knew how to run design control, knew how to troubleshoot medical devices. And unfortunately, it wasn't in time because the partner canceled for lack of progress. They canceled the agreement. We had to lay a bunch of people off, including the founders. And founders decided, okay, we know how we're going to control this. We're going to sue the company. Now, lawsuits are a terrible idea. If you're ever in the situation of having to consider suing your company as a founder, please don't do it. You're going to kill the company. Okay, the lawsuit killed the company. The founders stayed on the board because they owned a bunch of the company. We got to $700,000 insider round to help bridge us to a financing that we were trying to secure. And unfortunately, when they sued the company, after that financing, the bridge financing said, well, there's some money in the company, we should sue them now. That torpedoed any subsequent financing for the company. And that lawsuit, of course, went on for years. We had to close the whole company down. We had to give the facility back. The IP started expiring because we weren't able to pay on the IP. And eventually we just turned what was left over to the founders just to get the lawsuit out of our hair. And founders set up a company, and they have all the same stuff we had at our previous website. And they have no financings that they've ever been able to do. They have no progress that they've ever been able to show. And so it's a zombie, but they're in control. So that's the important part. They're in control, but it isn't going anywhere. So the next slide is the next company, and the last example that I'll share with you. It has a graphic image of, a clinical, graphic clinical image. So for those who are squeamish about those kinds of things, I just wanted to put up a warning. It's only one slide. You can turn away for that one slide. I'll let you know when that slide is over. This is about skin and soft tissue infections. We're going to talk about the worst of the worst right now. There's over 1 million skin and soft tissue infections and ulcers in lower extremities in the US every year. There's over 300,000 surgical site infections that infect patients after surgery every year. And the outcomes are terrible. 36,000 patients who have these lower extremity ulcers and infections will have amputations. And the drug resistant infections are becoming a bigger part of the problem and are going to be very difficult to treat as we see more and more of that in the future as well. So this is an example of the therapy I'm going to talk about. So this patient, you can see necrotic tissue covering most of the calf of this leg. And this patient is probably going to be a candidate for amputation. But instead, this therapy is used on that patient. And here's a couple months later, where not only is the infection completely cleared, but the patient has been successfully grafted with new skin. And although this is clearly a major scar area here, this looked great compared to the starting point. This is awesome. Now, Dr. Barry Silberg had developed a technique for introducing fluid into skin and soft tissue using ultrasound. He developed this for a completely different application. He developed this for when you harvest the saphenous vein out of the leg for cardiac bypass surgery. Okay, that's the vein that you're going to replace clogged arteries with when you do cardiac bypass. You opened up the leg, dissected out the vein, ignored the leg for however many hours it took you to complete the cardiac bypass, then you went back and you fixed the leg. And the problem is the tissue dehydrated, infection could take hold, and although the cardiac bypass might be great, there were a lot of complications with the leg. So he developed this technique to hydrate the tissue in the leg so you didn't have this complication. It was great, except that as soon as he got this to market, they developed arthroscopic surgery to dissect out the saphenous vein without opening up the leg. And so it wasn't needed anymore. But he realized he could put something in the fluid. It didn't have to be just normal saline. He could put antibiotics in the fluid, for example. And in fact, he had a physician who was doing a cardiac procedure on a patient that had a MRSA infection on their chest. And the physician's like, I'm afraid to open them up because I'm afraid they'll get MRSA systemically and it'll kill them. So he did this procedure on the patient's chest with an antibiotic. And lo and behold, not only did it prevent the patient from getting MRSA in systemic circulation or in their heart, but it actually cured the infection. And so then he's like, okay, I need to try this on more patients. And he did. He tried it on a bunch of patients. And it turned out that it was extremely effective in curing very serious infections with common generic antibiotics. So great product profile. There's a huge need, as I've already discussed. We have a product that can use an already approved ultrasound system, already approved generic antibiotics, put them together in a unique kit that can be used for patients and create a very substantial market opportunity where 86% of the revenue was coming from these consumable kits. So this is like the perfect medical device. Okay, this is what everybody on the investor side wants to see for a medical device. So a lot of stuff had gone right. We had a system that made sense. We had an investigator-sponsored IND that he had obtained. He'd been able to treat a whole bunch of patients. Successful treatment of things like MRSA, over 20 patients. Necrotizing fasciitis, this is flesh-eating disease. Okay, this is the toughest stuff to get rid of. He's able to clear that. Irradiated tissue is really difficult to work with. Able to work with that and clear infections from irradiated tissue. Gangrene, really bad. Able to cure that too. All with 1 to 3 treatments. So we had other surgeries, reproduces techniques as well. So not only did he have more than 140 patients he'd done, but other surgeons had done more than 25 patients and gotten the same results. So it's clearly a generalizable technique that can be used by others. So we reacquired the rights to the ultrasonic device because it had been licensed to another company who was going to market it for saphenous vein harvesting. We had new patents issued on this application, more were pending, but something went wrong. So the founder, he's not recognized in infectious disease at all. So he has a large burden of proof. He's a plastic surgeon and he's in private practice. Okay, similar story to some of the others you've heard. But he also had an ex-wife as his office manager who was part of the company team. And there was an awful lot of tension that was still there. And that made it very difficult to work in that team. And the founder needed control. He needed to absolutely control the company. He needed everything to be done his way, which is also very difficult if you don't know how to develop medical products and devices. He decided he wanted to initiate a clinical study with the Bronx VA. And they were going to do a study on their patients, and we would supply everything. The IND, the devices, the consumables, the training, everything. But he wouldn't let me put a contract or agreement in place with them because he was afraid it would scare them off. And I said, I'm sorry, without an indemnification and a clear agreement about how this is going to be done, I can't be your CEO anymore. And so I said goodbye. Now, founder didn't care. He still had his company. He had full, control over everything. But what he'd also done before that final last straw is he had turned down a $5 million Series A, which for a medical device company with this much already done was going to be great. We're going to get to market. He'd also turned down a NASDAQ listed company, offered him 7% of the parent company and 49% of his company as a subsidiary, and they would take over funding it. And he said no to that because he would only have 49%. Anyway, I left. Founders continued. They renamed the company 3 times. That's always helpful. And had a rotating pool of executives that they brought in. That's always good. And they've made no progress. The materials they show are the same ones they were showing more than 10 years ago. So again, something that could make an astonishing difference in the care for these patients is not coming to market for reasons that have nothing to do with the technology. So what did we learn from these 2 examples? Well, unrealistic or control-focused founders can sabotage everything. Lawsuits do not solve your problems. Being controlling is not necessarily of a zombie, is not necessarily a success. And if you have good technology, you still need good development practices to make that technology work. So the biggest issue, and I'm sure you've heard this before, and if you haven't, where have you been? For founders, it's do you want to be king or do you want to be rich? Okay, king, I'm in control. You can see that from several of my founder examples, was the most important thing, was being in control. But the result of being in control was that they weren't rich. They were in control of something that was going nowhere. So if you're going to be rich and have your thing make a difference, then you need to be able to step away from being in control, let other people drive. People who actually know how to steer the car, who've driven this race before. Okay, that's who you want in control of your company. And again, if you haven't read The Founder's Dilemma and you're an aspiring entrepreneur, or you're an entrepreneur that's never read it, go and read it. It's probably worthwhile. There's another really serious issue, though, with founders, early founders, and that is that a lot of founders think that the idea is 95% of the value. And they should be getting a corresponding cut of everything because they have the valuable thing that they're granting to whoever joins the team, granting to whoever invests. But investors and companies have a very different view. 95% of the value is the execution that allows you to have a product from that idea. Ideas are a dime a dozen. Making a product from that idea that actually changes care and improves outcomes, that's where the hard work is and where all the capital goes. So that can create lots of tension unless entrepreneurs understand that the idea is only the starting point. It is not the full race. So table stakes for doing it right. This should be stuff you've already heard. This should be stuff that's obvious. This should be stuff that may have a different resonance, having heard a bunch of failures. Table stakes is your ante. You want to get in the game of driving a startup? This is what you have to ante up. So you have to ante up a very significant market opportunity. You have to show that your technology or your drug or your device, your solution actually solves that particular problem. And you need some proof of concept. It doesn't have to be clinical yet, but some proof of concept that you can do that. You need to show clear and compelling product advantages over the other things that are out there and the other things that are coming along that might be out there when you get there. You need a credible team with relevant experience that knows how to deliver on what you're proposing to do. You need a clear plan for how that development is going to take you from where you are now to where you need to be to have a product that's launched. You need to have protection for that product. You need to have clear sources of sufficient capital. So you need to be able to say, here's how we're going to get money all the way along the way. And here's how we're getting the first money, for sure. We've got that already lined up. We need clear exit strategy so that investors who invest know when, how, and how much they're going to get back for that investment. Now, it's all an approximation, it's all an estimate, but you have to be able to articulate some plan for exiting. Now, I've driven home the message that you need money. So where do you get that capital? Okay, much of this already should be known, but there may be a few other sources of capital that come in here that you aren't familiar with. So I'll start with the beginner capital, which is what everyone should know about. Grants, your university, grants are always a starting point for many different programs that come out of universities. Friends and family, that's usually your first capital. Also, angels are very useful at the beginning. Their check size for an angel group is, 100,000 to 500,000, maybe a big super angel group might be $1 million. They're small stakes capital. When you graduate to the next level, that's when things get a lot harder. But there are quite a few options. Okay, everybody thinks of VCs as being your option for the next level, but there's a lot of other options. VCs are the most important one and the one that everybody goes to first, but there are foundations and family offices and high net worth individuals that also fund the next level. And there's also strategic investors, which if you can land a strategic investor is probably your most important thing because they're the ones that could be your acquirers later. And everybody loves that if you have a strategic investor involved. And then what I call the end games, these are all the sources of capital that help you get across the finish line. If you can actually get some licensing revenue or service revenue for what you're doing, that's awesome. That's great. That will validate you have a product that people will pay for. Special purpose acquisition corps, they were really popular a few years ago, super hot, SPAC market, and it's died down quite a bit. But these are where people put money in a company and they look for products they want to bring in. Okay, so it's an option, still out there. There is crowdsourcing. If you're going to crowdsource, you should do a Reg A or a Reg A Plus filing. These are SEC exempt public offerings, so it's like a mini IPO, but without having to go through the SEC. But it still takes a lot of work. And then there's the IPO, the initial public offering. This is everybody's holy grail. This is what you want. This is your best chance of liquidity and exit from the company. It's also really hard. And in fact, in 2021, we were seeing about 35 to 40 IPOs a quarter in biotech. In 2022, that dropped to 4. And that's where it's been ever since. So IPOs has suddenly dried up as an opportunity for biotech. And as a result, venture capital isn't investing in new biotechs. They're investing in their existing portfolio to get them teed up for when the IPO window opens. It may be starting to open now, but it's not back to 35 or 40 a quarter. So after all of that, I want 2 thoughts as sort of my conclusions from this for you. The first is learn from the failure of others. Don't make the same mistakes everybody else has made. Make new ones, it's fine, but don't make the same mistakes. And secondly, now a lot of people do this because they think it's a great way to make money. I do it because it's a great way to make a difference. I may or may not make money on the startups I'm running, but what I'm trying to do is make outcomes for patients much better by introducing something new that will improve care and improve patient outcomes. So after hearing all this, you still want to be an entrepreneur? So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions from here.
All right, thank you, Michael. We'll go around with the microphone for people to ask questions. Maybe I'll start with one, since you talked quite a bit about the founders wanting to over control, their ideas and things like that, not be diluted. What are some strategies? And that's, I think that kind of ties in a little bit to the unknown founder, right? In my experience, one way in some of my startups we've dealt with that is to bring in champions that are on the customer side, so sometimes clinical champions, and give them a small amount of equity to get involved in what we're doing. That means giving up some control, of course, but then you've got some experts that do have perhaps some influence in the field. Are there other strategies for someone that is either an unknown founder or perhaps working with a company where the founder wants to really maintain a large percentage of that equity?
There are some. I can't necessarily say they're always successful. The ones I've employed are bringing in expertise from outside so that they have a credible external source, another party that can help explain how these things go. I've also mapped out what is the dilution going to look like if we're successful, and what does that mean in terms of the value of what you will own? Because founders look at dilution as a negative every time. But the thing is, if you're successfully proceeding through all the different stages of investment, you're increasing the value of the shares you own, even if the shares you own is a smaller percentage of the company. And so stepping founders through that whole experience and process so that they know at the end, yes, I only own 15% of the company at the end, but that 15% of a $1 billion exit is pretty big, and if that's our target and that's what we think we can achieve, it's worth going through the dilution to get the capital, to hire the talent, to do the studies that create that value at the end. And at the beginning, that 75% that you own is only worth, $5 million. And when you own 15%, it's worth $150 million. Explaining that so that they start thinking in terms of what value have we created, not what am I losing because I'm losing shares. Again, I can't say that this is always effective because some founders just have a feeling that they're the only ones that understand their technology well enough to make it work and to make it successful. And those founders you just can't work with, and you just shouldn't work with.
Hi. Thank you for your very talk. I have a question, and that was regarding companies that fail. Some of them seem to have very amazing thing in them. For example, the one that reduced infection. But what would happen with someone else? Would we have to wait for someone else that comes and brings a different antimicrobe to board? Or yeah, it's just interesting.
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is that can somebody kind of resurrect or create an equivalent of what's already failed at another company? Absolutely. The problem is that a lot of the challenges will still exist. For example, if you're looking at the company that was doing ulcerative colitis, okay, you still have to figure out how to do the clinical study. Or maybe now you can convince the FDA not to do that clinical study and you have a faster path. But now you don't have the IP for that. And the IP is held by somebody else, or it has expired. And now you don't have any protection for that. So if you go through the expense of doing the clinical study, you don't have any way of protecting the product that results from that. And so this is the dilemma, is that most of the things that have failed, they're not going to have protection anymore. And nobody's going to be willing to fund those because there's too much of a risk that somebody will come out with a generic version of that. So this is the infuriating irony of medicine, is that we drop the great therapies that could be much better than what we have currently because we can't make enough money off of it. And so we're not going to do it. So that's the dilemma. And yes, absolutely, if somebody could find a solution to that, or frankly, if generic companies were willing to actually try to upgrade a bit and come out with essentially a generic, a branded generic, that's a way to do it. And some generic companies have started doing that, but not in the same sense of what you're talking about. Yeah.
You seem like maybe a great person to sell on why, if I'm a founder, I should bring in a CEO rather than trying to be a founder.
Oh, now you don't have to sell me on that.
But have you seen any successful founders as CEOs, or do you have personal opinions on that, or and why especially should it be a good idea to bring in somebody?
So I've been a co-founder of one company. All the other companies I've led, and I've led 5 companies, have all been companies that brought me in as a CEO. They reach a stage in their evolution where they no longer know what they need to do, and they no longer know how to do it. And they've had the wisdom of saying, let's find somebody that does. And so they brought me in. I'm running 2 Canadian companies. Canada has a real shortage of people with biotech experience, leading biotech. So they obviously troll the US, because I live in San Francisco. I don't live in Canada, for that kind of expertise. So I think it sends several messages to investors also. So if a founder is willing to bring in an outside CEO with experience, it says to the investors, they're serious about the company. If a founder insists on being in control, then investors look at that as a likely issue for the future. It's likely to be a problem somewhere down the line where I'm going to have to take the founder out of that position of control. Now, of course, you always read about the success stories where the founder stayed in control of the company all the way through and it's a wild success. Those are rare, but that's what we hear about because it's a success story. The vast majority of founders who stay in control of their companies, especially in biotech, ultimately will fail. So absolutely bring somebody in and do it as soon and as fast as you can.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I'm curious how you see the role of geography as a strategy. I know that University of Oregon, Night Campus, we're still new, we're still building, but in terms of geography, is there benefits or is this more just in this modern age, we can connect to people from far away? So I'm curious your thoughts.
Geography used to be, I think, much more important than it is now. Both companies I run are virtual companies where we have people both coasts of the US, we have people in Canada, and those companies function just fine that way because entrepreneurs like to be able to work flexibly, and investors like cheap stuff. And if you have a virtual company, it's a lot cheaper than a brick and mortar company. It's nice to have some presence in talent pools for what you need. For example, medical devices, Twin Cities is a great place. There's a lot of medical device research and development and companies that are in that space. So there's lots of people with experience in that space. It's nice to be in the Bay Area for biotech and pharmaceuticals. There's plenty of biotech experience and talent pools here. So, but if you're a virtual company, you can recruit those talent pools and just have them work virtually. So I don't think geography plays as much of an important role. The way geography plays a super important role is on the investor side. Investors in the US like companies to be incorporated in the US, so they're bound by US law. And so if you're a company in Canada or you're a company in Europe or in Japan, you're going to have trouble recruiting US investors as part of your investment syndicate. So that's where it becomes really important. It's not so much being around other people with the same stuff. It's about being where the laws are going to be comforting to the investors.
Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. My question is, for those of us who like to invent things, what should we look for in CEOs when we're trying to find one to hire?
So you want to look for experience in what it is you think you would need to do for your product. So depending on what it is, you're going to look for a CEO that's done something like that before, has successfully raised money. Okay, that's your number one job as a CEO. So your number one criteria of a CEO should be a CEO who has raised money in the field that you're planning to try to prospect for the funds you need. The number two thing is a CEO has got to be somebody who shares your vision and is good to get along with. Okay, I have a group of CEOs that meet, monthly or so that I was part of for many years, and we had what we call the no assholes rule. You don't want to work with assholes. Okay, you don't want to work with an asshole CEO. Okay, so it has to be somebody that you get along with, that you can trust, that you feel comfortable with, that you would tell them when things went wrong. That's kind of your benchmark for your relationship. Is this somebody you feel completely comfortable telling something went wrong? Because if you don't feel that, that's not the relationship you need with that CEO. They need to be somebody you would feel confident you can tell them something went wrong, and they're going to react in a constructive way. They're going to help figure it out. They're not going to get all excited. They're not going to get all upset. They're not going to start blaming people. They're not going to panic. So that's your benchmark. Somebody who knows your space, has done it before, who can raise money in your space, and will treat the rest of the team well. Won't panic when you tell them something went wrong.
Is it on? Oh, thank you so much for your talk. I think one thing, especially in the first examples that you were showing, is there's kind of this underlying aspect of the importance of communication and communicating your ideas. So my question is, I was wondering how, where on the priority list, or how is it important to either onboard or outsource for somebody who can create a visual identity for a company, or a communication specialist to really get your idea out there and communicate it effectively?
So it depends on your audience for communication. Okay, so think of this as maybe concentric circles. My first communication priority is within the company. Okay, everybody's aligned, everybody knows what's going on, everybody understands. One of the ways I do that is I have, for some companies, weekly updates that I prepare that highlights what's going on this last week. On the business, on the technology, on the product development, whatever it is, what's going on this last week, so that everybody knows what's going on. Especially if the company starts to grow and get big enough that it's not 6 people sitting around a table every day. The next group, of course, is the sort of investor base that you want to appeal to. Now, when you say kind of branded outreach and company identity and so forth, investors aren't looking at social media to figure out what companies they want to invest in. So it takes a very sort of specialized approach to engage with investors, to figure out what investors and engage with them and raise your visibility and awareness in that space. And alongside investors, you have to also think about the people who those investors will rely on for feedback and advice, which means the key opinion leaders in your field where you're developing product. It means that the people who are active in your space for various reasons, like patient advocate groups for whatever condition it is that you're developing a product for. So you think about investors and the adjacent groups that care about what you're doing and raising your awareness in those groups. And then only when you get to, you know, a year, 6 months from product launch, do you really care about raising awareness broadly and where the company identity and all these other things start to become a real, you know, important part of that launch strategy. But until you get there, you know, you need to focus on those first two groups.
Well, we're at the top of the hour.
Okay.
Michael, one of our purposes of doing this is to help our community build more entrepreneurial judgment, which means not making the same mistakes, as you say, but also, you know, starting to learn to recognize when the stars are aligned, and it has all those factors. So thank you for helping us doing that today. And thanks for everybody for coming today. Let's thank our speaker again.